Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Southport Armchair History, brought to you by the Southport Historical Society. I'm Liz Fuller. I'm the Vice President of the Historical Society, and I'd like to thank the Southport Library and the Friends of the Library in helping us spread the word about these programs. So today's topic is Southport and historic Black colleges and universities. So the first half of the presentation will be about the history of these institutions in North Carolina, and then the second half will be a discussion of some of the people in Southport who attended these colleges and how they were able to get an education. So, what is an HBCU? HBCUs are U.S. institutions of higher education that were established before the Civil Rights Act in 1964 with the intention of primarily serving the Black community. So in the beginning, HBCU enrollment was limited by law to Black students, but since the middle of the last century, they have opened up to all students, and today about 25% of the students who attend HBCUs across the board aren't Black. Most of these institutions were founded in the years following the Civil War, and the majority of them are in the South. There was 100 years between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Act. And during that time, there was intense legalized segregation in a large part of the country, what we usually refer to as the Jim Crow era. Most colleges and universities in the South prohibited all African Americans from attending, while those in the rest of the country employed quotas to limit the number of Black people who could attend. So HBCUs were essential in order to give Black Americans an opportunity for an education. North Carolina is home to 12 HBCUs, 10 of which are still in existence. One of the first HBCUs in the entire South was founded in North Carolina. And the HBCU with the largest student body is also in North Carolina. North Carolina had the first HBCU in the nation to offer a 4-year medical program, the first HBCU in the nation to open its doors to women, the first in the nation to grant full degrees for teaching in the elementary grades, and the country's first state-supported liberal arts college for Black students. So there's quite a lot to be proud of. In October 1865, a 35-year-old Union officer named Henry Martin Tupper moved to Raleigh, North Carolina from his home state of Massachusetts. Tupper had graduated from seminary school in 1862, and he had planned to become a missionary in Africa and bring Christianity to the natives there. But the war intervened and he enlisted. So while serving as a soldier, Tupper became aware of the needs of the displaced freedmen in the South. He realized that he could be of service to his own country. And so a few months after he was mustered out of the military, Tupper was commissioned by the Baptist Home Mission Society to aid the freedmen in North Carolina. So he and his new bride boarded a train and made their way to Raleigh. On December 1st, 1865, Tupper held his first Bible study program among the local freedmen. So that date is counted as the beginning of the institution that he went on to develop. It's only about 10 weeks after the first HBCU in Atlanta. So North Carolina missed by about 10 weeks of being the first HBCU in the country, but still, it's the second, and it was very close second. He used the Bible classes as a means of teaching them to read and write. He hoped to encourage them to become clergy and develop their own congregations. A few months later, his wife, Sarah, began teaching similar classes to Black women and girls. And at that time, women were rarely treated as equals. So when the Tuppers decided that women should have equal access to education, it was no small gesture. Before long, they realized they needed to have an established place for their classes. Tupper took the $500 that he had saved while he was in the Army, and he purchased a plot of land. He and his students built a schoolhouse despite the fact that he had never constructed a building before. They just sort of figured it out as they went along, and he called the school the Raleigh Institute. As the school continued to grow, he got contributions from the Freedmen's Bureau, the AMA, the Freedmen's Aid Society, the Baptist Church, and his own friends up north. The biggest single donation was for $5,000 from a friend in Vermont named Elijah Shaw. So Tupper changed the name of the school to Shaw. Eventually, they were able to purchase a larger plot of land, and this time they built a building out of bricks. So again, learning as they went along, Tupper and his students learned how to make their own bricks out of the clay soil on their land. They drew up the plans themselves and did the majority of the labor. All of this was done to save them money. This is the building that they erected in the 1870s. It had a 165-foot frontage. It stood 4 stories high, and it had this tower that you see in the middle. At the time, it was actually the most commodious school building in all of North Carolina. In it, it had provided classrooms, instruction services, a library, and lodging. It basically housed the entire university. So this building no longer stands today, was actually demolished in the 1960s to make room for a library. But it lasted a good long while. So the second building to be constructed on the campus was Ph.D. Seminary in 1875, and it was named for a Vermont contributor to the college named Jacob Ph.D. The building has 4 floors and an attic, and in 1882 they added a wing. So this seminary was reputed to be the first building ever erected for the education of African American females, and it was devoted to training women in cooking, sewing, music, and religion. However, the records of the university show that the women had the option of obtaining the same curriculum as the men if they chose to. Now, for the sewing classes, they obviously needed material to sew. So Henry Martin Tupper bought the material for the students in the sewing class. Then they would, in their classes, turn it into garments. And then he took the garments and he actually sold them himself in an effort to pay for the cost of the material and other expenses. So he tried very hard to make it self-sufficient. SD Hall still stands today. It houses the office of the president and other administrative offices for the university. It's the oldest remaining building at Shaw University, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. I think it's very pretty. In 1866, when the Raleigh Institute was first being developed, Tupper had dreams of building a medical school. So in 1881, that medical school became a reality when they raised $15,000 in donations. Their biggest donor was Sarah Tupper's brother, Judson Wade Leonard. So the medical school was then named the Leonard Medical School after her brother. The complex consisted of 3 structures. There was a 4-story medical dormitory that would hold 75 men. I don't have a picture of that one. Then there was the Leonard Medical Building, which you see in this picture off to the left with the towers. That contained the lecture rooms, the dissecting rooms, and an amphitheater. And then that large building to the right was a 25-bed hospital. So this was the first 4-year medical school to train African-American doctors in the South. And there you see the graduating class of 1889. That was 1886, I think, was the first graduating class, but this was the class of '89. Leonard Hall served as a medical school until 1918. During its 36-year history, the school graduated nearly 400 physicians, most of whom went on to provide critical services to underserved populations throughout the South. And some went on to lead distinguished careers in medicine, education, and government. So here's a better picture of Leonard Hall in 1899. Up in the right-hand corner, you can see more of what the building looks like. And then to the left, as it looks today. It's still standing. It's used for classes and administrative offices, and it's a national, it's on the National Register of Historic Places. And yes, the students did make the bricks for the building. And in the lower right is the old hospital building, which is now used as a dormitory. So in 1888, the university opened a law school. It was, now we don't know the full curriculum of the law school, but we do know that it was the only Black law school that had a course in legal shorthand. And the course was offered because it was thought that knowing shorthand might broaden career opportunities for the graduates. So if discrimination kept them from getting a job as a lawyer, they might be able to work in a clerical position or as an office assistant in a law office. So Shaw University graduated 57 law students before the department closed in 1916. But as you can imagine, not everyone was delighted by the progress being made by Tupper and his university. For more than 30 years, since 1831, it had been illegal in North Carolina to teach any Blacks, freed or enslaved, to read or write. Any white person caught doing so was charged a high fine of $100 or more. So think about that. It was if someone beat their slave or raped them, that was legal. But if they taught them to read, that was fine. So any Black person, freed or enslaved, who was caught teaching or learning to read was subjected to 39 lashes with the whip. So this sudden change of philosophy to encourage Black education was perceived as a real threat. From the beginning, Tupper and his wife were subjected to midnight raids by the KKK. They would hide in the cornfield behind their house and pray that their home would not be burned to the ground. And later, that same cornfield was the location where that brick Shaw University building was built. Henry Martin Tupper and his wife, Sarah Leonard Tupper, devoted their lives to Shaw University. When they passed away, they were buried in Tupper Memorial Garden on the grounds of the university in front of Shaw Hall. And Shaw Institute, which is known today as Shaw University, came to be known as the mother of African American education in North Carolina. The founder of North Carolina Central University and the first presidents of Elizabeth City State and North Carolina A&T universities were all Shaw graduates. And the third president of Fayetteville State University was also a Shaw graduate. And NC A&T was started on Shaw's campus before being relocated to Greensboro. So within a few years of Shaw's founding, several more schools were established. Most of these were backed by Northern religious groups and missionaries. So as we discussed, Shaw was founded by the Baptists. Then there were two started by the Presbyterians, one Methodist, one Episcopalian. And eventually there were schools that were started by Black denominations. So there was the AME, or African Methodist Episcopal, and AMEZ, African Methodist Episcopal Zion. So as I mentioned, the majority of the donations for Shaw and the religious-backed schools came from Northern organizations and philanthropists. So this wasn't just because there was Southern white resistance to the education of Blacks. It was because that's where the money was. So prior to the Civil War, the wealthiest part of the US was in the South. And of course, the wealth was not evenly distributed. There was widespread income inequality with a few very rich planters and many, many poor farmers. Much of that personal wealth was in the form of assets, hard assets, which could be sold or used as collateral. So that included land, livestock, crops, and enslaved people. During the war, most wealthy planters lost their land, their livestock, their slaves, and as well as any means to produce any more crops. And what little cash they did have was tied up in Confederate bonds, which were worthless. So following the war, the majority of the wealth was in the North. The North's economy had actually increased during the war, bringing economic growth to both the factories and the farms. And also, since the war had been fought almost entirely on Southern soil, the North didn't have to face the task of rebuilding that the South did. So, for example, I totaled up the personal value for Smithfield Township in 1860, based on the census. So this is not, this is for all of Smithfield Township, not just the Smithfield city limits. So it includes the plantations that line the Cape Fear up like Orton. So as you can see in this chart, in 1860, there were 840 free people living in Smithfield Township, with a combined personal value of $738,000. That excludes any real estate. This is their personal value, but it does include the 912 enslaved people who were living in the township. 10 years later, the population was 1,611 people with no one enslaved. The personal value of the entire population totaled just $25,000. So there was a decrease of over $700,000. This was a huge change, and it undoubtedly created a great deal of resentment toward the freed slaves and toward the Northerners who came down to take advantage of the chaos and the poverty. So even if there had been a desire to donate to the African American schools in the South, there wasn't the means, especially in the early years following the war. This is a postcard from sometime in the late 1800s, and the caption reads, "A typical Negro home in the Southland, Southport, North Carolina." And the inscription on the other side reads, "This picture was taken on the edge of town, a true representation of a Negro home. I have not sent you many views of just the town, but some of the interesting places." So even though it looks like the people in this picture were dressed up to go somewhere or perhaps to get their picture taken, you can still see that they were living quite sparingly. And this is a photo taken on the Kendall plantation sometime in the late 1800s. The people living on the plantation were most likely sharecropping. And it's evident again from this photo that no one had much money to spare on education, but at the same time, it was seen as important to lifting them out of poverty. This is Dr. Curtis. He was an influential man in Smithville and then in Southport when the name changed. He was mayor in 1875. He was the physician for the quarantine station for over 20 years. He was a businessman and a property owner. And his youngest son ran a newspaper and published a book that his father wrote about the history of Smithville from 1848 until the turn of the century. And we do sell that book on at the Historical Society website if you're interested. Even though he had been raised in the North, he had moved to Southport as a young man, and he lived here for the rest of his life. I think he was about 30 when he moved here. It's likely that his views were shared by multiple Southport natives. So here's an excerpt from his book where he discusses his views on education. He says, "The intellect of the Negro was not sufficient to originate liberty, nor did they know what to do with it after they got it. Therefore, they fell into the hands of designing men, politicians, carpetbaggers, scalawags, and schoolmarms who emigrated to the South in great numbers, all assisting to make true their conviction that the Negro was equal to the white man." And then a little bit later in the book, he continues his views, and he says, "There are classes of persons whose brains cannot be developed to any great extent, and it is a waste of time and money to try to make preachers, lawyers, doctors, and schoolmasters out of men whose highest development could only make them skillful in the development of the soil." So we don't know that everybody in Southport felt the way he did, but there was probably certainly some people that did. So in all of this, I don't want to give the impression that this was all a struggle between the white missionaries and philanthropists from the North and the impoverished, bitter white KKK of the South, with the freedmen sort of passively caught in between like pawns in a tug of war. The freedmen were very much engaged and had much more agency than that. As much as the Southern whites were resistant to the freedmen getting an education, the freedmen were equally intent on getting one. They knew that without an education, they would never be full citizens. They would always be vulnerable to being taken advantage of and being kept in low-paying jobs. So as soon as many of the students got a bit of education, they turned around and shared it in their own communities to friends and neighbors who weren't able to attend classes. And some of the graduates formed schools of their own in their own communities. So in 1873, Bennett College had its beginning in the unplastered basement of a small Methodist Episcopal church. 70 young men and women started elementary and secondary level studies there. Within 5 years, a group of emancipated slaves purchased the present site that Bennett College is on for the school. The Freedmen's Aid Society took over the school and it remained under its auspices for 50 years. Eventually, college-level courses and permanent facilities were added, and the school eventually became Bennett College for Women. And then Fayetteville was an example of the Black community taking control of the education of their children following emancipation. So prior to the war, there had been a sizable free Black community in Fayetteville with a number of prominent businessmen. Two brothers started elementary schools after the war. And then these schools were merged in 1867 when 7 Black freedmen who had been free even before the war got together and purchased a piece of land to build a school on. And this school was unusual. You can see it in the lower left-hand corner because it had a second floor. And enrollment varied with the season, but as many as 300 students were taught in the school. It was named the Howard School after the head of the Freedmen's Bureau. So 10 years later, Governor Vance asked the legislature to establish a normal school for educating teachers. So a normal school is what they used to call a teacher school. And due to the law at the time, if Vance was going to establish a school for white students, he also had to establish one for Black students. So after considering 14 different schools, they decided on utilizing the Howard School as the basis of the normal school. And a large part of why they did that was because of how efficiently it had been managed over the prior 10 years. So the school was called the Colored Normal School, and it was established in the second floor of the building. And that school eventually became Fayetteville State University. Charles Chestnut was the first president of the Fayetteville Normal School. Now, he had been educated in Howard Elementary School, and then he became the president, and he would go on to become the first significant Black novelist in the United States. His book, The Conjure Woman, I think was his first book, but The Marrow of Tradition is particularly interesting because it's his novelization of the Wilmington massacre in 1898. In 1890, Congress passed a law stating that if a state had a land-grant college, they had to either accept both Black and white students in the college, or they had to open a separate facility for Black students. So North Carolina did have a land-grant college, and they didn't want to integrate, and so they decided to establish a separate college for Black students. This school was called the Agricultural and Mechanical College for the Colored Race. Initially, it was located on the campus of the Shaw Institute, and it started with 4 teachers and 37 students, and their first offerings were agriculture, English, horticulture, and mathematics. And then after the first year, it was relocated to Greensboro. And the first president of the school was John Oliver Crosby. He was a graduate of Shaw University. And initially, the school was co-ed. It was open to women as well as men. And I don't know why. Maybe it was because it was started on Shaw's campus and Shaw was co-ed. Maybe it was because Crosby had graduated from Shaw and he'd seen that that worked. But in any event, it was open to women. But then in 1901, the College Board voted to exclude women from the school. And that policy was in effect for 27 years until 1928, when it became co-ed again. The school went through several name changes, and then finally in the 1970s, it became North Carolina A&T State University. So another illustration of how the schools fed into and helped each other is the story of Winston-Salem State University. So when Simon Green Atkins was 17 years old, he entered St. Augustine's College. And then when he graduated, he began teaching, and before long, he ended up at Livingstone, where he headed the grammar department for 6 years. Also serving as the treasurer for the last 2. And then while he was there, he organized the North Carolina Negro Teachers Association, which was a professional organization for educators. And then he went on to found the school that would become Winston-Salem State University. So he came to Winston in 1890 when the city offered him the position of principal of the public school for the Blacks. Soon after arriving, he initiated a project to develop Columbian Heights, a neglected section of town, in order to provide Blacks with better housing condition and ownership of their homes. He himself moved to this development in 1892 and started a school there the same year. Then in 1895, he resigned from his position with the public schools to work full-time with his school, which by then was called the Slater Normal and Industrial School. The first year, there were 25 students and 1 teacher. But the school grew rapidly and expanded under his leadership, and then the state bought the property in 1905 and took full control. 20 years later, it was renamed the Winston-Salem Teachers College, and at that time, it became the first African-American institution in the nation to grant full degrees for teaching in the elementary grades. And then in 1969, it became Winston-Salem State University. So if you saw my program last month when we talked about politics, there were several Black state legislators in North Carolina in the 1800s. And one of those men was Hugh Cale from Elizabeth City. So Cale was a merchant and a civic leader in Elizabeth City. He had a strong interest in education, and he had served as a trustee for both NCA&T and for Livingstone College. He served 4 terms on the North Carolina State Legislature. And in 1891, he introduced a bill for the establishment of a normal school in Elizabeth City. This school was established and eventually became Elizabeth City State University. And then Peter Reddick Moore, who you see there, was a graduate of Shaw University and became the president of Elizabeth City. And that was a role that he would play for the rest of his life. So over the course of about 30 years, that's really quite a progression in Black American education. The first schools were started by religious, missionary, and freedmen's bureaus. Then they were backed by state and federal government, with the Black community being a driving force in the establishment and leadership of the majority of the schools. One thing you might have noticed is that these schools were very vocationally oriented. They taught some professional skills like teaching and ministry, and to a lesser extent, medical professions and law. But the major focus was on industrial and vocational skills, and this choice of curriculum was deliberate. So at the time, there was an ongoing controversy in the country about the type of education that Black people should receive. Many felt that a liberal arts education would be wasted on Black Americans. It would only serve to make them dissatisfied with their lot and ruin them for hard work. On the other hand, a vocational education could make them better workers. So very similar to some of the arguments that Dr. Curtis was making. Creating vocational schools was also a strategic move to get more funding. So as I mentioned previously, most donations came from the North, which was an industrial region. They were looking for a trained workforce. And so they were more willing to invest in vocational training, but not so much in liberal arts programs. So 11 of North Carolina's 12 schools were established before 1900. Then, in 1910, a final school was established. That school was established in Durham, North Carolina, which at that time had a thriving Black business community known as Haiti. It was one of several communities in the US that were nicknamed Black Wall Street. A man named Dr. James E. Shepard, who was one of the most influential Black men in North Carolina in his lifetime. He was one of the original founders of North Carolina Mutual, the first and largest life insurance company that initially serviced Black Americans and still exists today. So you can see the interior of the life insurance building and the people from the company standing outside, and then the actual building that they had. Shepard was a graduate of Shaw University's pharmacy program, and he was the first African-American druggist in North Carolina. In 1910, he founded the National Religious Training School in Chautauqua for the colored race. And what's especially amazing about this is that this was a liberal arts college, not a vocational school. And he was founding it during the Jim Crow era in 1910, 10 years after Black men in North Carolina had been disenfranchised from the vote. 15 years later, the state of North Carolina took over the funding of this school, making it the first state-supported liberal arts college for Black students in the country. The school's name was eventually changed to NC Central University. So that's the origin story of the 12 HBCUs in North Carolina, and you now know probably more than most people do about higher education in North Carolina. But as you look at this map of these institutions, you might notice one thing. None of them are anywhere near Southport. Brunswick County was a poor, sparsely populated county, and the circumstances were not right for an institution of higher learning to be built here. In fact, it would take 70 years after the Civil War for Brunswick County to get its first school for Blacks that went above the 7th grade. But that didn't stop some Southport young people from getting a higher education, and I've selected the stories of 6 Southport students to share with you. So the first woman I want to tell you about is Sarah Mackenzie. She was born in 1879, the first generation after emancipation. Her parents were children when the Civil War ended, and they both learned to read and write. It's possible they learned at the Freedmen's School at St. Philip's Church on Moore Street, or maybe at an informal school in their community. So in those years, education for everyone, but especially for Black children, was very hard to come by in Brunswick County. But both Sarah and her brother Willie went through the 7th grade. Now, as you'll see as I go along, it would be decades before there were any Black schools in Brunswick County that went any higher than 7th grade. So if Sarah wanted more education, she was going to have to leave the county. Somehow, Sarah's mother, who was a widow by then, managed to send Sarah to Elizabeth City Normal School. And at that time, tuition at the normal schools was free if the student agreed to become a teacher of Black children after graduation. But Sarah and her family would still have had to pay for her room and board, her school supplies, her clothes, and her travel. Sarah completed her high school education at the school, and after graduation, she returned to Southport, and she eventually became a teacher in Southport. So one of the questions I had when I looked at the map of the HBCUs was, why did Sarah go all the way to Elizabeth City to get her education when Fayetteville was so much closer? But then I thought about it a while, and I realized that it was probably actually easier for her to get to Elizabeth City than to Fayetteville. So at that time, roads in Brunswick County were practically non-existent, and it would have been an extremely long and grueling and dangerous journey to get to Fayetteville over land. She could possibly have traveled up the Cape Fear River, but in reality, the easiest route would have been to travel by ship up the coast to Elizabeth City. So after giving it thought, I came to the conclusion that that was probably how she traveled, and hopefully someone like her brother escorted her there. And it's also possible that her brother, Willie Mackenzie, helped to pay for his sister's education, helped her mother out in coming up with the money. So even if you're not familiar with Sarah Mackenzie's before, it's likely you've heard of her brother, Mr. Willie Mackenzie, one of the first Black business owners in Southport. His name is on the Southport Historical Society plaque on Howe Street that talks about Black businesses. And if you're from Southport and you're of a certain age, you're most likely remember getting a sherbet from his store, which was popular with everyone in town. And one thing that I found interesting is that Sarah did get more education than her brother. And we can only speculate as to the reasoning, but one theory would be that as a man, he would have been able to get a job even without an education, whereas Sarah's options would have been more limited. And in fact, prior to teaching, Sarah worked as a laundress like her mother, which was an extremely physically taxing job. So the next woman I want to tell you about is Miriam Odell Gore. Her grandmother was the first generation of Miriam's family to live in Southport. She lived in Florida before the Civil War and then moved to Southport in her 20s. And not much is known about Miriam's grandfather. But Martha, her grandmother, could read a little bit, but she couldn't write. She was older when the war ended, when she would have had a chance to get an education. She was also busy. She worked as a servant and as a laundress, and she raised her children. Miriam's parents were Alexander Gore and Lily Parker. Alexander Gore is who's in this picture here. So Alexander and Lily were the same generation as Sarah and Willie that I just spoke of. Like them, Alexander obtained a 7th grade education in local schools, and his wife Lily achieved a 4th grade education. So in 1903, Miriam was born. She was the second of 8 children in her family. So you may know that a lot of people in Southport had nicknames when they were growing up, and Miriam's was Peaches because she was so sweet. At that time in Brunswick County, there were still no Black schools that went beyond the 7th grade. So like Sarah Mackenzie, Miriam would have to leave the county if she wanted to get more education. Now, Miriam and her family were members of Mount Carmel AME Church in Southport. And the Kittrell School in Kittrell, North Carolina, was an AME school that taught secondary education. So when Miriam was 14, she left Southport to attend that school. And upon graduation, she attended Elizabeth City School for 2 years of college, getting her teaching degree. So Sarah had attended Elizabeth City School to get her high school years of training, but Miriam was able to go then and get her college degree. So like Sarah, Miriam had a brother who was more well-known than she was. If you haven't heard of Miriam, it's likely you've heard of her brother. His name was Elias Gore, but a lot of people called him Nehi. He was her younger brother, but I'm sure she never referred to him as her little brother. He stood at 7 feet 8 inches tall. He towered over everyone else in town. It was said that he weighed 400 pounds and wore a size 16 shoe. By all accounts, he was a very kind man, and he was known as Southport's gentle giant. Nehi worked as a menhaden fisherman, and he helped to pay for Miriam and several of his siblings to go to school. So in that picture, you see him standing next to his sister and his brother, and the man in the picture standing with him is John, and his brother John, and he also went to college. So Nehi probably helped pay for him too. So you know that I wondered, how did Miriam get to Kittrell to go to school when it was inland? Well, by 1917, when Miriam was heading to Kittrell, Southport had a train depot. It was on the northwest corner of Moore and Rhett Street, across from the cemetery. So Miriam, I looked at these railroad maps, and Miriam could have taken the train to Nassau from Southport, and from there she could connect with a line that would go directly to Kittrell. So it's likely that one of her parents or brothers accompanied her there. Of course, this was during the Jim Crow era, so if they did travel this way, they would have been relegated to segregated seating. After graduation from Elizabeth City, Miriam became the Jean supervisor of Black schools in Brunswick County. Eventually, she met a man, she fell in love, she got married. Her husband was from Florida. He was a graduate of Hampton University and Penn State. He taught tailoring at Virginia State College. So they relocated to Virginia, and Miriam became the supervisor for that county. The couple kept a summer home in Southport where they would visit every year. Much of their time was spent on their boat, which they named the Miriam G. They were both avid fishermen, and they were the first Blacks in Southport to have a slip at the marina. In 1966, they both retired from teaching and moved to Daytona Beach, Florida. But Southport was still home, and they returned often. When her husband passed away, Miriam returned to Southport for good. She built a new home on St. George Street, where she lived out the rest of her days. So the next person I want to tell you about is a woman named Dorothy Smith. Dorothy was born in 1917, the year that Miriam Gore was heading off to Kittrell. But even though Dorothy was much younger, just like Miriam, she was only 2 generations away from slavery. Her grandfather had been born in the 1840s in Hyde County. In his late teens, Abram left the plantation he was living on and enlisted in the Union Army. He served in the 37th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops. So Dorothy was an only child. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother was unable to raise her. So instead, her grandmother took her in and raised her in Southport. Her grandfather had passed away about 5 years before she was born, but he left Dorothy a valuable legacy. Because of his military service during the Civil War, her grandmother was able to draw a widow's pension. So you see here the card for her filing, and that in 1915, she filed as a widow for Abram Blunt, and that his service had been in the 37th Company of the USC Infantry, which was the U.S. Colored Infantry. Her grandmother used that pension to help support Dorothy when she was growing up, and then to send her to 4 years of college at Bennett in Greensboro. So I don't have any photos of Dorothy, but these are some pictures of Bennett Bells, as they were known, from the time period when she would have attended. Dorothy, including to the left, there's a picture of a Bennett bell ringing the Bennett bell, which I really like. Dorothy got a degree in education from Bennett, and she taught in North Carolina for several years. Then she decided to get a master's degree from Columbia University. And after that, she taught in the New York public school system for 38 years. So in 1998, the Southport Historical Society and several other organizations got together to honor Private Abram Galloway and Dorothy's grandfather, Private Abram Blunt, and to install an official bronze military plaque on his gravesite. At that time, Dorothy, who was 81 years old, wrote a letter to the society telling us how much she appreciated the recognition for her grandfather. And she also told us about her life. She let us know that in addition to teaching, her career as teaching, she had been fortunate enough to travel extensively around the world, and she had even attended a dinner at the White House with George Bush. She said that she could not have accomplished what she had in life if it had not been for her grandfather's Civil War pension funding her education at an HBCU. So here are a few excerpts from her letter where she says, "I was born here in Southport, North Carolina. My grandmother reared me on the pension Grandpa Private Abram Blunt received from serving in the Civil War. It was also on his pension that I was able to attend a 4-year college, Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, I pay honor to Private Abram Galloway and to Private Abram Blunt, my grandfather, my general. Sincerely, Dorothy Blunt Smith Wall, 1998. And we were so grateful that Dorothy wrote to us about that. She passed away 2 years later, so it's a real treasure that she told us about her life and what it meant to her. So the next people I want to tell you about are a father and a son. The father's name is Elmer Davis, and his son is Anthony Davis. So when Elmer was 17 years old, the U.S. entered World War I. Elmer attended a student army training corps at NCA&T in preparation for entering the military. So this was kind of like a precursor to ROTC. However, by the time he finished his training, the war had ended and he wasn't sent overseas. So this is the only picture that I can find of Elmer. He's the one highlighted there, he was a Menhaden fisherman, and he's playing checkers, or he's watching some of his crewmates play checkers. And the man standing there is the captain of the crew. That's John Erickson. He served in World War I, and he was later the mayor. And the person to the left of Elmer, where you can just see his head, that is Elias Gore, also known as Knee-High, who I discussed earlier. And I just mentioned that because he's actually Elmer's brother-in-law. So I'm just kind of underscoring that Southport was a very small community. Even though Elmer didn't go to war, over 20,000 Black North Carolinians did. And many of them hoped that their military service would demonstrate their worth as citizens and their moral claim to more rights and opportunities. The irony that they were fighting overseas to make the world safe for democracy while they were denied basic voting and civil rights at home was not lost on them. But unfortunately, they returned to a country that was still very hostile toward them. The country was experiencing high unemployment and the aftermath of a global flu pandemic. There was a lot of discord, a lot of competition for jobs, and the result was a rise in the white supremacy movement and an increase in violence against Blacks. 1919 is referred to as the year of violence and as the Red Summer, as hundreds of Black men, women, and children were killed through lynching, arson, and mob violence. The KKK saw a resurgence across the country, especially in northern states. Its headquarters was actually in Indiana. The exact numbers are not known, but membership was at least 3 million and could have been as high as 6 million. And for the first time, there was a women's auxiliary to the KKK known as the Women of the Ku Klux Klan. So all in all, this period of time is viewed as the lowest point in race relations in our nation's country since the Civil War. And it was in this environment that the citizens of Brunswick County finally decided to build a Black school that would go over the 7th grade. So funding from the school was a combination of public funds, private donations, and a grant from the Rosenwald Foundation. The school was completed in 1921. But unfortunately, before any classes could be held, the school was burned to the ground. Undaunted, Southport began work on building a new school, Brunswick County Training School No. 2. This school opened in 1925 without event, and it continued to serve the community for nearly 50 years. Here's a picture of the school taken in 1928 showing all of the students, and for some reason a chicken who decided to photobomb the picture. Anthony Davis, Elmer's son, attended BCT and graduated in 1943. He attended North Carolina College for Negroes in Durham, where Dr. Shepard was still the president. Anthony was an avid basketball player, and North Carolina College had a champion team that was coached by John McClendon, who revolutionized the game by developing the fast break style of play. He was a new coach when Davis was there, but he would eventually go on to be inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. Davis was only able to stay at NC College for 1 year before he was drafted into World War II. Once more, Black American men were fighting for freedoms overseas that they did not have at home. And once again, they hoped that their participation in the war would prove their rights to full citizenship. But when they returned home, nothing had changed. Jim Crow was still the law throughout the South, and Black Americans were still disenfranchised. And while it wasn't as blatant as in the South, job discrimination and housing discrimination existed in the North as well. Following World War II, the GI Bill aimed to help American World War II veterans adjust to civilian life by providing them with benefits, including low-cost mortgages, low-interest loans, and financial support. But although it was a federal program, it was managed at the state level, which meant it was applied unevenly. So consequently, Black Americans did not benefit nearly as much as white Americans, even in the North. For example, in the New York and northern New Jersey suburbs, 67,000 mortgages were insured by the GI Bill, but fewer than 100 were taken out by non-whites. Blacks were hampered when it came to education as well. By 1946, only 1/5 of the 100,000 Blacks who had applied for educational benefits had been registered in college. And in the South, where 79% of the Black population was living, HBCUs were the only educational options. And the majority of these schools were small, they were underfunded, and they were literally overwhelmed by the enrollment requests that they received. So due to a lack of resources, they were forced to turn away approximately 20,000 veterans. But despite these challenges, Anthony Davis and several Southport GIs managed to get enrolled in NC-A&T on the GI Bill. While he was at A&T, in addition to his academic studies, Anthony got to polish his skills on the basketball team. And after he graduated, he returned to Southport to teach at BCT, where he had gone to school. He became a popular social studies teacher and basketball coach. The basketball team at BCT was a real point of pride in the Southport community, and it was due in large part to Coach Davis. So here's a picture of Coach Davis with the 1965 conference tournament winning team. And this team is special in another way, in that 2 of Coach Davis's sons, Tony and Tim, were playing on it. So now I'd like to tell you about another father and son, Eugene W. Gore and Willie L. Gore. Eugene W. Gore was born in 1916, right before the start of World War I. He was 9 years old when Brunswick County Training School opened, so he could have gotten a high school education right in his own county. But his parents died when he was young, and he had to drop out of school to support himself and his 7 younger brothers and sisters. But throughout his life, he retained a passion for education. He became a lifelong learner and an avid reader. He worked his way up from kitchen boy to become one of the first African-American captains in the Great Menhaden Fishing Fleet of North Carolina. He obtained his U.S. Merchant Marine license at the master's level, and he became a captain on the Southport Fort Fisher Ferry. After obtaining his GED, he attended UNCW, where he studied social studies and marine science. And in the 1990s, he took classes in basic computer skills, keeping up with the latest innovations, even though by that time he was in his 80s. So it's no doubt that Captain Gore was an inspiration to his own 3 children, who all obtained college degrees. His son, Willie, graduated from BCT in 1960 and headed to NC-A&T to study biology. So as I'm sure many of you will remember, the 1960s were a time of civil awakening in this country. As an all-Black college, NC-A&T provided a safe space for intelligent and educated Black Americans to discuss the pervasive discrimination that they and their families had faced. And out of these discussions came ideas of what to do to raise awareness and to protest. On February 1st, 1960, 4 A&T freshmen sat down at the counter at Woolworth's and asked to be served. As innocuous as this sounds today, this was a groundbreaking moment then. The men were not served that day, or the day after, or the day after that. The peaceful protest went on for months. As time went on, more and more A&T students, as well as Bennett College Bells, joined in the protest. At that time, very few expected the protest to actually change things, and they couldn't have imagined that 60 years later, the original protesters would still be commemorated as heroes and would be remembered as the Greensboro Four. Back then, they were simply 4 young men standing up for what they knew was right. 2 years later, it was Willie Gore's turn to stand up for his rights and for the rights of Black citizens. He participated in a similar protest at S&W Cafeteria on Main Street downtown in Greensboro. He and his friends went inside and stood in line. Instead of serving them, management called the police. The students were not surprised. They had known they would be arrested. Willie spent a day or 2 in jail before being bailed out by representatives from the Congress of Racial Equality. So some students might worry about what their father would think of them being arrested when they were supposed to be studying at college, especially a father who valued education as much as Captain Gore. But it's likely that Captain Gore was proud of his son's willingness to stand up for his rights. Captain Gore himself had stood up for his rights and had broken the color barrier in his career when he became a Menhaden fishing boat captain. Later, Gore traveled to Washington to hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak. And in 1963, he was one of the founders of Southport's NAACP, and he eventually served as the president of the organization for 20 years. In his role as president, Captain Gore stood on the courthouse steps in Southport, along with Southport Sheriff E.V. Leonard, and removed the final colored-only sign from the separate entrance doorway. So it's likely that Captain Gore felt that by protesting against discrimination, his son was carrying on a family tradition. After graduating from NCA&T, Willie Gore served 2 tours with the 82nd Airborne Division. He served in Vietnam with both the 25th Infantry Division and the 1st Cavalry Division as Infantry Rifle Company commander. He spent 29 years in the military. During that time, he attended Howard University, an HBCU located in Washington, D.C. He obtained his master's degree and then taught military science there for 3 years. He graduated from Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and the Industrial College of the American Forces in Washington, D.C. During his 29 years of service, he had assignments all over the world, and he earned innumerable decorations, commendations, and awards. He retired from the military as a full colonel. And some of you may recognize Colonel Gore, as he and his wife returned to Southport and have lived in St. James for 27 years. And I think he might be on the call today, so hopefully we'll get a chance to meet him at the end. The final family I want to tell you about today is the Arthur and Mattie Pearl Gore family. There were actually several more children in the family than the ones I have shown on this chart, but I just showed the ones I'm going to talk about. The Gores lived in a rural farming community in Bolivia. And as we discussed, throughout the 50s, Brunswick County Training School was the only school in the county that went beyond the 7th grade. So that meant that if a student wanted a high school education, he or she had to travel to Southport. So when Arthur was a boy, he attended BCT, but since he lived so far away, he came in once a week, and then he boarded with a family in town so he could attend classes. So this shows the commitment that his own parents had to education, because they would have had to come up with that money every single week to pay for his room and board. Now, sometimes Arthur would catch a ride to Southport, and other times he would walk the whole way. By the time his own children were attending BCT, there was a bus that would pick the Bolivia students up and bring them to school. One of the other high school students would work as the bus driver. Arthur graduated from BCT in 1938, so he was a couple years ahead of Anthony Davis, who would become the social studies teacher and the basketball coach that we talked about. So during World War II, Arthur was drafted in the Navy and he served in the Pacific. After the war, he attended NCA&T on the GI Bill. But by that time, he was married, he had 3 children, plus he was the only boy in his family that had been born in 3 generations. So his wife, his mother, and his grandmother were all depending on him to work the farm. So Arthur set aside his own dreams of a college education, and he started working toward the dream of having his children receive the education that he had been unable to get. So Arthur's son, William Waddell Gore, began school at BCT in 1948. He graduated in 1959, the year before Colonel Willie Gore, who I told you about in the last family. Now, even though they have practically the same name, as far as I know, they are not related. But William Waddell Gore headed off to North Carolina A&T like his father had done. William was a scholarship student. He received a $1,000 Smith Douglas Fertilizer Company scholarship, and that scholarship paid $250 a year for 4 years. He also worked on the college farm on weekends. So during his freshman year of college, he would get up early on Saturday mornings and catch a truck out to the farm. He said that he remembered picking chickens that would be served in the campus dining hall for Sunday lunch or dinner. During this period, William began to get discouraged about his situation. He didn't have nice clothes and things like the other students at the school had, and he felt out of place. So he wrote home and he told his mama that he was going to drop out of school and come home to get a job as a pulpwood truck driver. But his mother was insistent that her children were going to go to college. She wrote him back and she told him to stay in school. Then she began to raise more vegetables on the family farm, and she started selling them on the back of the family's truck in Wilmington. She and a friend, Dorothy Gardner, would travel to Wilmington each week to sell their produce so she could send a little extra money to her son and to help him stay in college. Maddie Pearl's hard work paid off because her son graduated from A&T, becoming the first one in the family to get a college degree. And because of his degree and because he had participated in ROTC in college, when he graduated, he was awarded a commission in the Army. He served in Germany for 2 years and for 1 year in Vietnam. He was released from active duty in 1968, but he continued in the reserves. He moved to Winston-Salem and he worked for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. He retired from the service in 1992 as a colonel. The following year, he took early retirement from R.J. Reynolds to go back to school and obtain his divinity degree from Hood Seminary at Livingstone College, an HBCU. And you can see him here with his proud parents, his father, Arthur, who had given up his own education dreams for his children, and his mother, Maddie Pearl, who had planted the extra vegetables and drove them into Wilmington to sell them in order for him to get his degree. So I'm sure that it was a very proud moment for the whole family. This is a picture of Colonel William Waddell Gore from just a few years ago. So following his graduation from Hood Seminary in the 1990s, he devoted his second career to his church. So Colonel William Waddell Gore graduated from high school in 1959, and his younger sister Marilyn graduated in 1970, and a lot changed in Southport in that decade. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Topeka Board of Education that separate schools were inherently unequal. Segregation was no longer to be allowed in public schools, although school districts were given a reasonable amount of time to integrate. So here you see a cartoon from 1962 where a little girl is holding a birthday cake talking to this man, and she says, "I'm 8. I was born on the day of the Supreme Court decision," and behind them you still see James Crow Public School. So the implication was that states were dragging their feet on getting integration to happen. And so North Carolina, like many states, was not in any hurry to integrate the schools. So when Colonel Gore graduated in 1959, Southport schools were still segregated. And in fact, they stayed segregated until 1969, 15 years after the Supreme Court ruling. Marilyn Gore was a senior in high school the year that BCT was integrated. By then, the school was called Brunswick County Southport High School. And the reason for the long name was that the school had integrated that year with Southport High School, the white school in town. It was a difficult year at best, and I have a whole other program dedicated to that topic. But in short, Marilyn rose to the challenge of that year, and she graduated second in her class. She also served as the president of the Home Economics Club. She had a keen interest in this area. Marilyn had been sewing and quilting since the age of 14, making items for herself and her family to use. Her first sewing experience was helping her mother make woven and tied floor rugs from feed sacks and tobacco twine. Her mother, Maddie Pearl, also taught Marilyn how to embroider and decorate homemade pillowcases, and her mother was an accomplished quilter. Home economics was a required part of Marilyn's high school education, and it was there that she learned to construct garments. Under the tutelage of Lizzie Mae Mitchell, Marilyn's home economics teacher at Brunswick County High School, she constructed her first garment. And then she used scraps from this garment to make an 8-pointed star quilt. And with the help of her mother, Marilyn made her second quilt, a lone star, from scraps of polyester fabric. So it had always been Marilyn's plan to go to an HBCU, specifically to Bennett, an all-female college. By the time she graduated in 1970, there probably were some options for her to attend a predominantly white college, but she felt strongly that Bennett would be the best fit for her. And I think she made the right decision, because this picture here was taken part of her senior yearbook at Bennett, and she certainly looks happy. Marilyn's parents, especially her mother, were very supportive of her educational goals. Her brother William was the first in the family to graduate from college, but Marilyn was the first female in her family to graduate from college. She obtained a bachelor's degree in family and consumer sciences with an emphasis on clothing and textiles from Bennett. She then obtained a master's degree in her field from Howard University, an HBCU in Washington, D.C., and a master's in counseling from the University of the District of Columbia, also an HBCU. So she attended 3 HBCUs in her educational career. Marilyn had a 31-year career as a family and consumer science area agent with the Cooperative Extension Services. Currently, she runs her own online quilting business. And that brings her full circle to her beginnings and her connection to her mother, Mattie Pearl Gore, the driving force behind Marilyn's educational aspirations. And so that brings me to the end of my stories of Southport HBCU graduates. These were just a few of the hundreds of Southport students who graduated from HBCUs throughout the years. These are some of the faces that are often shown in the news when people talk about graduates of HBCUs. And of course, these are some very accomplished individuals. But after today, I hope that when you hear about HBCUs, you'll also think of these Southport faces, and you think about all that they went through to get an education and all that they went on to accomplish. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing and turn this around, see if you have any questions or comments. All right, here we go. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Liz. Hi, Liz, I have a question for you. Do you know, besides Nehi, which of the people you talked about are buried in the Smith Cemetery here?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but I definitely know that. I mean, I have the records for that.
Great. Love to have that. And then if you want to tell those stories in short form on the Smith website that we're redoing.
Yes, I'd be happy to help with that.
Great, thanks.
So, and can I introduce Colonel Gore? Do you want to say hi to everyone? Just if you can take yourself off mute for a second. There you are.
Yes, and thank you very much. That was a walk down memory lane in many cases. Quite an education in other cases. And well done. I really appreciate it.
Can I ask? I kind of assumed what had happened when you did the sit-in and then got arrested. What did your father know ahead of time that was going to happen? What was his reaction?
Oh no. No one knew. In fact, I didn't myself initially. We had a meeting, core, and we decided our strategy, and I was all in. And no, he didn't have any reaction, any adverse reaction at all at the time, of course. And of course, later on, he was very proud, as you said, that I was interested. It was sort of with us. I was a advanced ROTC, and our cadre was sort of warning us about there may be some adverse consequences if we had an arrest on our record.
Yeah, I wonder.
And well, that's the only arrest I had in my whole life, and I tell everybody that's why I didn't make general. Otherwise, and that's my story. No, actually, the only thing that happened was I was given a regular Army commission because I was graduated as a distinguished military graduate, and it took a while for that to clear through the Army. They, initially when I came on active duty, I came on as a reserve officer, but it was cleared through the JAG program and so forth, and it was no problem. But that was good trouble.
Yes, you gotta get into a little good trouble, and it's a family tradition, so that's good. Thank you. I'm so glad you were able to join us today, and thanks for the pictures and things you sent to help me put the presentation together.
So I certainly would like to share this with lots of other friends and some of my classmates from A&T and other schools. And I assume the recorded portion will be available for me to forward. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. We'll get you the recording. So thank you.
All right, thank you.
This is Pat. I wanted to say that I was a high school student in Greensboro when the demonstrations were going on downtown. And I don't remember Willie, but I know he was over at the cafeteria, S&W, rather than in Cress's Woolworths, whichever it was. But certainly was an impact on us who were living in Greensboro at the time. Little, of course, did we know the full impact that it would be, and how it led to the opening up of the schools and restaurants and many other things. So being a child of the South, and especially being in that particular situation at a time in my life when, as a high school student, could understand that, and hearing comments from both sides of the story was an education for me as well. So I'm happy to have come full circle, to be an old lady sitting in a chair looking at a wonderful presentation that you gave today, Liz, and your graphics were exceptional today. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thanks for sharing that. That's
May
interesting.
may I just add a bit of information? During that time, not only Greensboro, but all of Gifford County, students were put in jail in Hyde Park and Winston-Salem, and the jails were filled in Greensboro, and they used a convalescent center for some of our students. And the other thing, the teachers would actually go to these places and carry on classes for a period of time.
Really? Wow.
It was a complete campus effort.
Yes.
That's amazing. That's really fascinating. I'd like to talk to you more about that, and I'd like to do a whole program on that topic because it's really fascinating.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Mimi, I think you got your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Yes. Just what an honor to meet Colonel Gore. It really is. I'm choked up. I've taught about this a lot, but I've not met those people who were directly involved. So always inspired. I wanted to ask Colonel Gore if I was familiar about SNCC developing around the same time out of Fisk University. I was wondering if they were getting training from CORE in the nonviolent tactics. I know Greensboro was the first lunch counter sit-in, but I know they use similar tactics. I was wondering if he was familiar with, I'm impressed by how many different groups were fighting for civil rights at the time, but the movement had not really come together, it seems to me, in our study. There were a number of groups that were involved. So I was just wondering if, how CORE had started in Greensboro, or when they came to Greensboro, and if they had any connection or coordination with SNCC.
I don't know the inner workings. I do know that our group in Greensboro, we did have considerable training and coordination. And the group I was with was mostly made up of Bennett College students. And of course, it was easy to join them because there were lovely bells.
Yes, The bonus.
Well, but yeah, we were well trained and coordinated, and in fact, they actually took care of all of our defense problems for us later on, and after we were arrested. So yeah, I think all the groups. I know the groups I was familiar with. All they all preached nonviolence. That was really a mantra for being successful.
Yes, yes. I agree from what I've read. And Liz, just wanted to tell you, great presentation. I learned so much, as I always do with these. And I hope when you do your presentation for our group at the library that you will be chiming in and giving us a lot more of this information. So thank you.
I'm glad you enjoyed. I'm glad you were able to get in.
Thank you.
Anybody else have anything?
I just want to say again, I really regret that Musette is not here today in this Zoom meeting. Of course, we know she's not in Southport anymore, but she doesn't do anything on the internet or whatever. So she would have enjoyed this so very much, especially she and Willie, such good friends too. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
also, Mr. Anthony Davis, you said he coached basketball, but he also coached baseball. Also, he coached the girls and the boys basketball team, and those were the only sports we really had when I was there was baseball and basketball. But
Yeah.
he was quite a gentleman, and of course, as you mentioned, the trade there, we had industrial arts, which included brick masonry, and we had the woodworks over there. And I was a brick masonry student. And the band. The band was a big part of it. So the community rallied around the band there at A&T. That was, here at BCT, that was a big part of the curriculum there. I think everybody in Southport was in the band, I believe.
Yeah, and my understanding is that the whole of Southport really embraced the band, that they kind of would refer to it as our band.
Because they bought uniforms and instruments, and they actually bought the activity bus to the community did.
That's amazing.
Yeah, Donnie gave us a great program on that band a while back. Yeah.
I played. I started playing. I tell one of my big regrets in life was I started playing trumpet in the 4th grade and played all through college. And then I put it down when I graduated, and I regret to this day that I didn't keep it going.
Well, you can pick it back up again, I suppose.
I have, it's just too hard to do. Thank you again. God bless you.
Okay.
Question. I got a quick question. Pat Fairfield, Arvin.
Oh, Pat Fairfield. That's how I was going to.
Yeah. I just we moved to Greensboro in the early 70s, and that was around the time when that Ku Klux Klan massacre occurred, the march of the, was that kind of a result of the sit-ins? And maybe Pat Kay can help me with that one, because I wasn't familiar. We moved in and it happened and it was so fast.
I remember the event, but as far as what led up to it and all, I was busy being married and having babies at that time. So
I remember that it was a march for civil rights, and then the Ku Klux Klan showed up. The police didn't do anything, and there was an outclash. And I know some people were killed in that whole thing. So there's been some inquiries in Greensboro about that whole reconciliation, and I'm not sure if that was an outcome of the civil rights marches. I would say in all probability that there was some connections, but you're right, it was a sad day. It was a sad event, and I think a stain on our state and on Greensboro at the time too. Mm-hmm. But we continue to march on, don't we? Look at today. Sounds sure do. Thanks lots.
Yeah.
Great presentation.
Thank you. There was Klan pushback even at the sit-ins, and Colonel Gore was talking about the students were very much trained in nonviolence. Certainly there were groups then that came in and provoked them. There was Klan members and also white teenagers, because that would just sound like a fun thing to do the confrontation. So they would come in and vie for the seats, and then they would do things to try to rile them up and try to engage them in violence. And I believe that they were very successful in being nonviolent, but as Colonel Gore said, they had a lot of training and talking to ahead of time of how to handle things. But all of it, I mean, that certainly caused a pushback even then. So I'm sure, things move forward, then there's pushback. You see that all through the 100-year period that we were talking about. Anybody else have anything that they want to say? Diana? Sorry.
Bob, I just want to say great job, Liz, but I also wanted to mention that people put down in your calendar because Musette is going to do a program for us in September.
Yes, good.
Put that in your calendar as well.
Yep. Yeah, I've already talked to her about that.
That's fantastic.
Liz.
Donnie, there you are.
I want to say great job. I apologize for no video. My hair doesn't get up on Tuesdays until about 2:30 or 3 o'clock. But you did a great job. It was worth me getting up to see this, and especially information on both Colonel Willie Gore and Waddell Gore. I know both of these gentlemen, and they're the type of people that sort of like made the work I've done speak for me, made the life I live speak for me. And I've got to tell this one story. Colonel Gore may shoot me, but I remember when he was in the band, when he was playing trumpet, he would practice on the back porch of his house because his dad owned a store. And as a kid, we were very annoying. You know how annoying a kid can be. And every time he would stop practicing, as soon as we could get a nickel, or either if we got 25 cents, we worried him to death because he would come in and open the store up, think we were buying something. We get 2 for penny cakes and 2 sodas, eat that, come back and get some more. But he is a great man, and he was a good trumpet player.
Donnie, I think you were responsible for him giving it up then. You just aggravated him to death.
No. He played after that because he played with A&T. And in fact, he and a couple of others from BCT, they played in the college band, and that's an accomplishment right there. I've learned a lot about Colonel Gore. Some things I've learned about him when he was in the military, he don't know I know, but he's a very modest man. And a great job, Liz. And thank you.
Thanks, Donnie.
I will tell you this, if you listen a second, William Waddell Gore, we actually were in the same grade in high school until we got to the 5th grade.
Oh.
And he and a few other lucky people were skipped ahead.
Oh.
They claimed because they were academically advanced, but I think it was only because they were teachers' pets. So, so he got the A&T a year before I did. But anyway, I know I still hold that against him.
Did anybody else? Thank you, Colonel Gordon. Diana.
I did have a question, Liz, and maybe you can direct me to some information. In several of your programs, you mentioned how the school had burned down before a class had been taught in Southport. Is there information available? Do they have? I'd like to research that further. Are there documents you can direct me to, or do you have more information about the circumstances there?
Donnie, do you want to respond to that, or?
I will be glad to. Yes, we do have, there was a letter called Cully's Letter. The school was supposed to open up in 1921. It was on a 5-acre plot. And there was something like a suit from the Weeks family about some of the property didn't belong to where the school was, because Rosenwald, the original design was a 4-teacher classroom, and it had to be on a 5-acre spot. Well, they finished the school because that was called County Training School #1. And all of a sudden, before they could hold a class in it, the school burnt to the ground. So that did it, that set it back some. And it's in the documentation. It's at Fisk University. It's on Rosenwald Fisk database. And the letter is called Cully's Letter. And what happened was the school was insured, but the bank went under. Southport Bank went under, so they didn't get any money. So then they had to go back and do it all over again. And one of the things about the blacks in Brunswick County at that time, they were very resilient. So they got a little bit upset and angry. So instead of building a 4-teacher classroom the second time, they built a 6-teacher classroom. But they had to build it on 3 acres instead of 5. And yeah, I can send the information to her about that, but it was under sort of circumstances that were a little bit, I don't want to say, but I'll send it to you. But I'll be glad to, because I would love for someone to find Cully's letter. I know a lot of this in the Rosenwald database in Chicago, but I haven't had time to research it all. So Liz, I'll get it to you and you can get it to the lady.
Mm-hmm. I know, and I've seen some of the Rosenwald letters. You know, they had a superintendent who would come and look at the different schools. And I did find one letter where he was saying that, you know, these poor people in Brunswick County deserve their money more than anybody. They've been through so much. You know, never anything that actually details what happened. I mean, you know, we know the school didn't burn down due to faulty wiring because it didn't have any wiring. So it wasn't that.
Well, Liz, Donnie, thank you very much. I'd be interested in any information you have on that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You're welcome. I'll get it to you. Liz, remind me, because you know
I will do that probably after the Black History Symposium, Diana.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Anything?
I just want to say this has been wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you, Jane.
So glad to have been able to view this and meet all these people.
Oh yeah, I know, that was a nice bonus. Okay, anybody else? Good. I just want to remind you that the Black History Symposium is starting this Friday. Friday evening, Ms. Carolyn Evans will be presenting on Zoom. The whole thing is on Zoom. She will be portraying Mary Ann Ford, who had been enslaved before the war. She was a cook in New Bern, and it's her life story. And so it's very interesting. And her story had actually, at one point, she knew Mark Twain. And so Mark Twain had written up her life story and published it in the Atlantic magazine. And this is based on his documentation of her life. So it should be very good. You might have seen Carolyn Evans before. She's been in Southport. She's portrayed Harriet Tubman. She's portrayed Stagecoach Mary. So she's a delight. And the nice thing about Zoom, I've been to the rehearsal, is that it's like it's a front row seat. So even though we're not right there in person, she's right there. There's nobody's head in your way or anything like that. So that's the advantage. If you want to register for that, just send an email to info@southporthistoricalsociety.org and we'll get you the Zoom link. The following weekend, there will be 3 days of programs. Each a couple hours each. They'll be discussing the Chitlin Circuit, which is the Black music groups that would come through the South, and Southport was between Myrtle Beach and Wilmington, so we would get some here in town at the Donnie, correct me if I'm saying any of this wrong, at the International Longshoremen's Association building. And Donnie's going to be presenting that, and he'll also be interviewing Henry Rose, who was the president of the Longshoremen, who helped arrange some of those acts. So, and he'll have music. And then there will be on Sunday, they'll be talking, or I'm sorry, Saturday, the second day of it, talking about some of the students who attended Brown's Chapel Sunday school. A lot of them went on to lead very accomplished lives, go to college and do all these things. So talking about some of those students and the influence in their lives that they got from their Sunday school. And then the last day will be the Gospel Fest. Again, it's going to be virtual. We're going to be doing it through Zoom, but it should be good. And there'll be individual groups, and I think even some church groups singing. So it should be very good. They're all free. And if you just send us to info@southporthistoricalsociety.org. We will get you all the Zoom links for those.
Liz,
Yes.
if I may, on Saturday, that one is as what is called They Made a Difference.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Featuring some of the students and teachers who was at Brunswick County Training School doing what we call the greatest generation, people born between 1900 and about 1930. This is where we'll have some of our teachers, some of the former students there, and I'll be doing a talk about a great deal of them. In fact, that is sort of relocated around students who finished around 1945, 46. And on Sunday, on the Gospel Fest, we're going to do it sort of like a semi-telethon, but it's really not a telethon, to help out Browns Chapel AME Zion Church. Now, we're going to feature former students of Browns Chapel's AME Zion Sunday School. But what we did was we picked the year, the ones that was in Sunday school back in the, I guess, the 90s and early 2000s, because Browns Chapel Sunday School goes all the way back to Colonel Gore and beyond, because Colonel Gore, correct me, Colonel Gore, if I'm wrong, was a member at Browns Chapel Sunday School because his great-grandfather, Mr. Junius Jackson, he was also a veteran of the Spanish-American War, was superintendent. Now that's way back there in the 50s. So if I try to get all of them who went to college and graduated and was successful, it would take too long. So we just decided to pick out a few of the recent ones. These kids are getting out of college about now. Most of them have already initially graduated from an HBCU, and most of them are going on for masters, and some of you been working on their doctorates now. And it's all to raise money to help Browns Chapel, because last year when we had that, I guess that northeastern that came through, that did damage at the marina, it came through Browns Chapel and it did some damage to the steeple. And at the time they didn't realize how much damage it did inside. And so we want to try to help them as much as we can. So we'll be asking for donation all 4 days about that. And we hope you enjoy it. I've been working with Liz and Bob because they're great. And we're trying to make this into somewhat a semi-production. So it looks like it was something that would be put on by Henry Louis Gates and his group, that we have pictures, we have interviews and all that. And I want to tell you, Liz and Bob are my saviors in this project, because they do an excellent job. So we hope you attend. If you can't, it'll be on, I guess, Facebook Live and maybe later on YouTube. And please, if you can, donate to Browns Chapel, because it is an old church, even though it's got the bricks on the outside. And I'm going to say this and be quiet. Colonel Gore's parents, Mr. Eugene Willard Gore and Miss Lois Mae Jackson Gore, donated the first bricks to put on that church. So it's, and I went to Sunday school there, so I have sentimental value about Browns Chapel AME Zion Church. Even played marbles in front on the big oak tree. So we hope to see you. Thank you.
Liz, I have a question about signing up for Zoom for those. We do need to go and to the website and ask about that. We will not be automatically sent the link like we are for these classes. Is that correct?
Well, you get sent the link because at some point you did sign up, and I just keep sending. If you
sign
up,
okay.
I keep sending
okay.
it to you. If you
Good.
send me an email and just say, you know, you want to sign up for the Black History Symposium, I'll send you all of them. You can choose which ones you attend. I'm not gonna. You don't have to sign up for, you know, this Friday or that Friday or anything like that. Just if you just say I want to do the Black History Symposium, I'll send it. And then I may just send it out to everybody anyway, just to round it up, but I'm not sure. I try to balance between giving people information and annoying them. And so if I know you've asked for it, I know I can send you the information.
Well, you know what? Just send it out to everybody and they can always delete it if they don't
Yeah.
want it.
Yeah, I try to walk a fine line. Okay, but Pat, I take it that means you want to be added?
Absolutely. If I'm
All right.
not, I do want to be.
Okay, all right, I got you. I got you.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions or comments before we go? Oh, and next month in the Armchair History, we'll be doing the frontline workers for the Spanish flu. So we'll be talking about the nurses at Fort Caswell and in Southport and what was going on with that. So we thought that would be timely. So
it's too bad you don't have anything to do, Liz.
No.
Yeah, it's been great. You've done some great things for us.
Oh, thank you, Pat. Okay. Anybody else? Anything? All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm glad. If you think of any questions later, always feel free to email, and we'll see you soon. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.